We all think we know Winston Churchill, the man with the eternal cigar, the voice of British resistance against Nazism, the leader who inspired a nation to never surrender. But what happens when a legend is analyzed without filters? What secrets hide behind his speeches? What decisions do we avoid looking at too closely? For decades, Churchill's image has been projected as that of an unbreakable hero, an epic figure, a symbol of strength, intelligence, and patriotism. Yet beneath that layer of glory, there are dark corners, controversial choices, and phrases that don't fit in the history books for school children. This isn't gratuitous attack or blind defense. It's an invitation to look with new eyes, to explore the shadows that also shape the very man so many admire. Because understanding Churchill in all his complexity doesn't make him any less great. It makes him more human, and perhaps more unsettling. Over the next few minutes, we're going to travel through the least illuminated passages of his life and legacy, from his personal excesses to geopolitical decisions that still echo in millions of lives. What you're about to hear may forever change the way you see one of the most iconic faces of the 20th century. Before becoming the symbol of British resistance, Winston Churchill was an ambitious young man, marked by a distant childhood and a surname that demanded greatness. He was born into an aristocratic family, but his father barely paid him any attention. His mother, an American socialite, was more interested in circles of power than in raising her son. That emotional void, as many biographers agree, made him someone who constantly sought recognition, even at the expense of good judgment. Churchill was no academic prodigy. In fact, he repeated a grade and barely excelled in mathematics or Latin. But his love for history and writing drove him to narrate his own life almost like a novel. By the age of 26, he had already published several books about his experiences as a war correspondent, shaping his image as a hero long before actually becoming one. His fascination with war was anything but theoretical. He actively took part in military campaigns in Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa, not as a regular soldier, but as someone fully aware that every bullet could be another glorious page in his autobiography. Some would say he sought death to prove himself. Others, that he simply wanted to feed his legend. From early on, he proved to be a man of contradictions, a liberal who defended the empire, a defender of democracy who despised certain cultures he considered inferior, a brilliant strategist who often ignored the advice of his most lucid advisors out of pride or stubbornness. The construction of the myth began long before World War II, and he was its chief architect. Churchill was keenly aware of the power of words. He didn't just speak to persuade, he spoke to endure. Every phrase, every speech, every photograph was another piece in the puzzle that would turn him into a symbol. But what happens when the symbol eclipses the human being? Churchill never hid his fondness for alcohol. In fact, he made it almost a part of his character. He used to say he had gotten more out of alcohol than alcohol had taken from him. But behind that clever phrase lies a far more uncomfortable reality. From early on, Scotch whiskey was his constant companion, not just at celebrations or dinners, but while working in meetings, even in moments of national crisis. It said, he began his day with scotch diluted in water, continued with wine at lunch, champagne in the afternoon, and ended with brandy at night. Some claimed his liver was practically a British fortress in its own right. But the question isn't how much he drank. The real question is, how did it affect his decisions? In crucial meetings like the conferences with Roosevelt and Stalin, his intoxication was obvious. Diplomatic records mention his aggressive tone, his insistence on impractical ideas, and his erratic way of handling key issues after a few too many drinks. Was he truly a functional genius, or just someone too powerful for anyone to call out his problem? His doctors knew, his aides knew, but no one dared confront him. Churchill even cultivated the image of the man who would not bend, not even before the bottle. He turned his weakness into part of his legend. In the midst of war, his dependence on alcohol was seen by some as part of his mettle. If he can face Hitler with a drink in hand, then he's invincible. people would say. But there were also moments when his judgment was clouded and the consequences were paid by thousands. Can we keep glorifying a man whose clarity, in the most critical moments, hung by a thread? Or is it precisely that complexity that makes his figure so fascinating? What do you think? Was Churchill's addiction part of his genius, or a risk we prefer not to face? When people talk about World War II, the image of the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, often appears as a heroic alliance against the absolute evil of Nazism. But behind the smiling photos and handshakes, there were shady deals, deep distrust, and pacts that tasted of betrayal. Churchill distrusted Stalin. He considered him brutal, unpredictable, and ruthless. Yet, he was among the first to accept the Soviet leader as a necessary evil in order to defeat Hitler. During the Tehran Conference in 1943, and later at Yalta and Potsdam, Churchill negotiated with Stalin the partition of Eastern Europe. That deal handed over millions of people to communist rule for decades. For some historians, that concession was a betrayal of the democratic ideals Churchill claimed to defend. For others, it was an inevitable strategic move in the post-war chess game. But the fact remains, Churchill agreed to keep silent about Soviet repression in Poland, the abuses in the Baltic states, and the relentless advance of the Red Army, all to keep the alliance against Hitler alive. With Roosevelt, the relationship was no easier. Churchill admired and needed him, but often underestimated him. His imperial vision clashed with American idealism, and while Roosevelt was betting on a post-colonial world, Churchill fiercely defended British supremacy. There were tensions, heated arguments, even mutual contempt disguised as courtesy. Churchill was not easily persuaded, and when he felt he was losing power to his allies, he turned to emotion, to grandiloquent speeches, or simply to political blackmail. In the shadows of those alliances, decisions were made that sealed the fate of millions. It wasn't just a war against Hitler. It was also a negotiation over who would control the world afterward. While Churchill was celebrated as a defender of freedom in Europe, in other parts of the world, his name evoked fear, resentment, or simply silence. Behind his passion for Western civilization was a fierce imperialism. For Churchill, the British Empire was non-negotiable. In his own words, it was a blessing for peoples who could not govern themselves. During his administration, decisions regarding the colonies were not made with a humanitarian lens, but with rules of power. In Kenya, India, or Palestine, independence uprisings were crushed with violence. The noble rhetoric of human rights did not apply if the person in question was not white, British, or Anglo-Saxon. One of the lesser-known episodes took place in Malaysia, when British forces launched mass repression campaigns under the pretext of fighting communism. Tens of thousands were detained without trial, and tactics were used that today would be considered the hallmark of a totalitarian state. In Iraq, when Churchill was Minister of War, he did not hesitate to approve the use of chemical weapons against rebellious Kurdish tribes. "I am strongly in favor of using poisonous gas against uncivilized tribes," he wrote without remorse. He was not simply a man of his time. Even by the standards of that era, his colonial views were extreme. The idea that the empire should endure was not just policy, it was part of his identity. For Churchill, losing a colony was a personal wound, a humiliation. Human cost did not matter, nor did the call for self-determination. His loyalty was to the British flag, even if that meant spilling other people's blood. And in that context, it's worth asking, can we admire a leader for defending freedom when he systematically denied that same freedom to millions? If you want to hear more uncomfortable truths like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we don't repeat what the textbooks say. We tell the stories that many prefer to keep silent. While Nazi concentration camps burned in Poland, while millions were exterminated with industrial precision, Winston Churchill knew not every detail, not every number, but the essentials. As early as 1941, British intelligence reports and testimonies from Jewish refugees reached his desk. And yet, the response was lukewarm. In a speech in 1942, Churchill condemned the Nazi atrocities, describing them as one of the most horrible crimes ever committed in the history of the world. But that did not translate into concrete action. There were no preemptive bombings of the railways leading to Auschwitz. There was no political priority to rescue the victims. Britain's borders largely remained closed to Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. Why? Some argue that resources were limited, that the focus was on winning the war, not redrawing humanitarian policies. Others suggest that latent anti-Semitism among the British elite, including circles close to Churchill, played a bigger role than most care to admit. Some historians go further. Perhaps European Jews simply weren't considered a strategic priority. Painful but possible. When called upon to act more forcefully, Churchill avoided committing the government. Official responses were diplomatic, ambiguous, evasive. Meanwhile, the crematoria continued to operate day and night. After the war, the narrative was rewritten quickly. Churchill became a symbol of resistance against Nazism and, by association, against the Holocaust. But the real story is more uncomfortable, because between knowing and acting there is an abyss, and Churchill, with all his power and vision, chose not to fully cross it. Winston Churchill will go down in history for his memorable quotes. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, or I shall never surrender, are phrases inscribed on monuments, in movies, and in school books. But there are other words that are rarely mentioned. In a letter from 1937, Churchill wrote, "I do not admit for a moment that the great wrong has been done to black people of Africa by being brought under rule of the white man." On another occasion, he declared that Australian Aborigines and Native Americans were weak races who had been displaced by a superior race. And regarding India, he stated that the hunger of its people was a result of breeding like rabbits. These were not youthful mistakes or isolated slips. They were part of his worldview. Churchill firmly believed in the supremacy of British civilization, in the right of Western powers to rule over the rest. His speeches in Parliament are filled with statements that today would be classified as overtly racist. Even when he defended democracy, he set limits. "Democracy is good for civilized peoples," he once said. And when criticized for his colonial stances, he scoffed. "I am not going to allow a group of disorganized natives to determine the fate of the empire." Why have these phrases been forgotten? Perhaps because they do not fit the heroic portrait that was built. Perhaps because we prefer to remember the strong voice that defeated Hitler, not the one that humiliated the oppressed. But they are there in official diaries, authorized biographies, personal letters. They cannot be erased. They can only be ignored. Or, better yet, confronted. And you? Can you admire someone whose words today will be deemed unacceptable? If these kinds of contradictions make you think as much as they make us think, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't sugarcoat history. We tell a whole. Few episodes in Churchill's life are as controversial and at the same time as silenced as his role in the Great Bengal Famine of 1943. More than 3 million people died in just 1 year. And while images of corpses on the streets reached the world, India was still the jewel of the British Empire. When the crisis erupted, the colonial government desperately pleaded for help. Rice was scarce, prices soared, and rural populations either starved to death or fled en masse to the cities. The British government, under Churchill's direct orders, blocked the import grain from Australia and other regions of the empire, prioritizing the stockpiling of food for British troops and citizens. Requests for help were met with indifference. There are documents in which Churchill, informed of the magnitude of the famine, asked why Gandhi hadn't died of starvation yet. In private meetings, he referred to Indians as responsible for their own fate, suggesting that famines were part of their customs. Only when international pressure grew and media reports could no longer silence the catastrophe did Britain allow the shipment of some supplies, which arrived too late and were insufficient. Political justifications no longer convince anyone that there was war, that there were priorities, that the empire had to be protected. The uncomfortable truth is that, under his leadership, The lives of millions in India were deemed secondary. The price of British survival was, in part, paid with the silent death of a distant people. The official story still resists judging Churchill for this tragedy, but the echo of Bengal still resonates, reminding us that even heroes can have stains impossible to erase. Reaching the end of this journey, it's almost inevitable to ask, what really remains of Churchill's myth when we shine a light on his shadows? The man who saved Europe from fascism, the strategist who stood firm when everyone else called for surrender, the orator who inspired hope on the darkest days. Could he also be the one who denied rights, perpetuated violence, and belittled other lives? Biographies tend to simplify. Heroes on one side, villains on the other. But history is an open wound. Churchill was both things, and perhaps neither completely. His life is a brutal lesson about the price of power, about human contradictions, and about how easily a statue can conceal sins, words, and crimes. His admirers argue that he did what was necessary, that in war there's no room for moral doubts. His critics claim his arrogance, racism, and coldness left scars on a world that still haven't healed. Where does the truth lie? Probably somewhere uncomfortable between both extremes. Churchill knew how to shape his own story. Even his flaws he turned into legend. His excesses, his hardness, his irreverence, all served a greater cause. But at what cost? Sometimes looking our idols in the eye reveals both their greatness and their wounds. And accepting that complexity doesn't make them more human. It makes them more disturbing. And you, which side do you take? Will history absolve him? Or will we finally see Churchill as he truly was? A hero full of shadows? If you like analysis that's not afraid to enter the gray zone of great historical figures, subscribe and share your opinion in the comments. Do you think humanity needs myths or does it need truths? Winston Churchill. For some, the last offense against darkness. For others, the architect of injustice and silence. When statues fall, history begins again. What we admire today may become a source of doubt tomorrow. And what we criticize now might one day, in another context, find justification once more. There are no easy answers, only stories, questions, and wounds that cut through the centuries. The truth is, the myth and the man will never be exactly the same. Perhaps Churchill's greatest secret was not what he hid from the world, but what the world chose not to see.